Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about Zeno's paradox and its relation to things like time and calculus. I've already talked about the relationship between time and calculus in another video, so I definitely recommend watching that one as well if you're interested in this topic. But to begin with, I want to make a claim about Zeno's paradox before I go into explaining why it makes sense that motion can exist in this way, even with Zeno's paradox being the, or even basically before I respond to Zeno's argument, I want to basically dismiss it here as follows. You observe motion directly, and you cannot contradict direct observation with any amount of premises, any amount of rationalizations. Zeno's paradox is pure rationalism. You cannot debunk something that you already see in reality. You see motion in reality. You see things moving in reality. You cannot start from these arbitrary premises and try to debunk something that you already see in reality. So this is the main problem with it to begin with. But then the question arises, how does Zeno's paradox sort of work with reality? How does this sort of weird paradox, how can this sort of thing exist and emotion still exist as well? Well, the reason for this is because the nature of time, and which is related to the nature of motion, because time is a measurement of motion. Time is sort of this infinite sort of thing. It's very much tied to the concept of infinity. If you think about it with the calculus analogy that I talked about in another video, calculus basically converts something that's like two-dimensional to one-dimensional, or one-dimensional to two-dimensional. It basically goes between dimensions for things. So basically, like when you find an integral of a curve, you're finding the area under that curve, and it basically does that by summing up all these individual lines underneath it and finding that area. Well, lines don't have area. Lines have a zero area. But when you sum up all the lines together, it basically gives you this sort of area. That's the same sort of thing with time, except time goes from zero dimensions to one dimension, while finding the integral goes from one-dimensional things, which are the lines, to two dimensions. But time, basically, you have all these individual instances in time, and you basically sum them up, and it creates a sort of line. That's how we perceive time, the sort of time line. There's an infinite amount of instances, but it creates this whole sort of line because you're summing all of them up. And when you have a massive sum of these sort of zero-dimensional things, or lower dimensional things, you basically get to these higher dimensional sort of things. And the thing with calculus, it's as it approaches infinity. It's not like an actual sort of infinite thing, because infinity is impossible because it lacks identity. But like as it approaches infinity, which the amount of instances of time that you perceive does approach infinity, then it basically creates a sort of timeline. Now, Zeno's paradox. Zeno's paradox, essentially, the one that I always hear, this is a destination, and this is you. You basically move halfway, and then halfway again, and halfway again. Well, then you can never really reach this point. This is basically the equivalent of the sum, this basic sum, and this sum, basically. His argument is that you can never reach one, because you would need an infinite amount of movements. You need an infinite amount of instances to actually reach one. Well, the thing about time, time is a sort of infinite number of instances. That's how you create this sort of timeline. This is how motion happens, basically. So essentially, when you have all these halfway sort of movements, you do get to one eventually. You do get to this point eventually, and this is sort of how time works. This is how motion works as well. There's this sort of infinite number of little tiny motions, these motions of zero that eventually reach this one point, this point where you reach an actual motion. So when you think about time in this sort of infinite sort of sense, which is basically what time is an infinite amount of instances put into this sort of line. Then you can kind of wrap your mind around this paradox a lot easier, because he said, basically the claim is that you would need an infinite amount of these sort of motions, these sort of halfway movements, to actually get to motion in general, to get to some sort of movement. Well, that's what you get with time. That's the thing. Time is sort of this infinite measure of an infinite number of instances in time, the sum of an infinite number of instances. So basically, when you have time moving forward, that's how you can get motion, because time is sort of an infinite sum of all these little instances, and that basically can get to motion, because motion sort of requires an infinite number of these little infinitesimal motions that lead to motion in general. So Zeno's paradox doesn't really contradict the nature of reality. Zeno's paradox doesn't contradict motion. It simply shows this lack of understanding of calculus, of the infinite. It shows this lack of understanding of time, basically, time being this infinite sort of thing. Well, we see time moving forward. We don't have this sort of infinite look at time. Basically, we don't see every infinite little instance of time, because our observation is to an extent basically how our eyes work. They take sort of snapshots of time as it passes forward. They take these little snapshots, and then all those individual points get summed into this sort of timeline, and motion takes place across that timeline, because motion is very infinite in nature when you think about it with regards to calculus and with Zeno's paradox as well. So it's not really a paradox. It actually makes sense with the nature of time and the infinite sort of nature of time. So yeah, reality is what it is. Motion is what it is. You see it in reality. Now you just have to kind of wrap your mind around it, and you realize when you wrap your mind around things, there are no contradictions in reality. So yeah, I think that's all I have to say for today. Thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next video. Peace.